Against happiness and kittens. Okay, so this video is not really against happiness and kittens. It's against the idea that happiness is the only intrinsic good. It's against the idea that happiness is all that ultimately matters. And the same with pleasure. So when you explore popular books and movies, it seems like many people think that happiness is all that ultimately matters. Others believe it's some form of pleasure. Others kind of combine the two. But I disagree. I want happiness and pleasure. And I couldn't live in a constant state of excruciating pain, but I don't think they're all that matters. I don't think they're the only intrinsic goods, a word I'll soon explain. So analogously, I cannot live without oxygen, but I don't think oxygen is all that matters, right? I'm not an oxygenist. So in the first couple of minutes of this discussion, I'll present one form of controversial hedonism and then challenge it with 10 thought experiments, arguments, and Socratic questions. And again, the question revolves or the discussion revolves around this question. Is happiness or pleasure, is it all that ultimately matters? Is it the only thing that you intrinsically value? Now, why is this discussion important? Well, besides being an interesting psychological and philosophical puzzle, this discussion is important because it seems logical for me to do whatever is necessary to get pleasure if pleasure is all that matters. And sometimes this can take a very benign form, like Epicurean philosophy, right? But sometimes it may take a more harmful form if pleasure is all that matters. And the same might be said of happiness, assuming we can later come to a clear definition of happiness. So, as with other philosophical topics, a person's fundamental beliefs on this topic and others, they're often unexamined and under the surface, but they influence how you think and feel and choose to live. As Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. So let's start examining it through this topic. Okay, let's first distinguish between instrumental and intrinsic goods. So most people say they want money, houses, cars, friends, vacations, and other goods. When you ask them why they want those things, their deepest answer seems to be because it will make me happy. That's their ultimate answer. So in this case, money, houses, cars, friends, vacations, quiet time, nature, whatever, they're instrumental goods because people value them as instruments to get happiness. They're a means to get the good life. Now, these people might be mistaken that cars or houses will make them happy, but the point is they value those things to get something else, right? The other point's a different discussion. Okay. But happiness seems to be an intrinsic good because people want it for itself. So for example, Bob doesn't want happiness to get money, he says. Rather, he wants money to get happiness. And if you ask Bob why he wants happiness, he may simply shrug his shoulders and say, well, just because. So happiness seems to be an intrinsic good because most people value it for itself, not simply as an instrument to obtain some other good. So there's a little activity you could do. You think about all of your values and you draw a little arrow for why you value that value. Okay. So I might say, oh, I value water. And you ask me why, and I draw an arrow and say, because water keeps me hydrated. And then you say, well, why do you want to be hydrated? Why do you value that? And I draw a little arrow that says it feels good. Okay, wherever the arrows end, there's no more arrows, those are intrinsic goods. Okay, so now let's change the subject a little bit. Hedonism, people who believe pleasure is or should be our ultimate goal are called hedonists. So hedonistic forms of philosophy have many strengths. And you can read about Epicurus for one beautiful form of hedonistic philosophy. Now, in this video, I'm going to focus on one hedonistic claim. Okay, this type of hedonist believes that happiness or pleasure is the only intrinsic good. This type of hedonist has an absolutist belief. She believes that happiness, or pleasure is the only ultimate good. And so she believes that those who deny that happiness or pleasure are the only ultimate goods are mistaken. So is that correct? Is happiness, or we could say pleasure, the only intrinsic good? Is it all that matters ultimately? More precisely, is my happiness or my pleasure all that matters in an ultimate sense? Well, let's get to the core of this discussion, the 10 objections to that idea. Okay, the first objection is to the idea that pleasure is the only intrinsic good. Pleasure is all that ultimately matters. So this is a very famous thought experiment by Robert Nozick. It's called the experience machine. Now, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy has a nice summary of it. Okay, so Nozick asks us to imagine that we have the choice of plugging into this fantastic virtual reality machine that provides an amazing mix of experiences. Once you're plugged into the machine, you don't know that your experiences are not real. You don't know that they're simulated, they're virtual. And you're going to experience much more pleasure in this machine than you would in the reality that you're currently in. Okay? So disregarding considerations about responsibilities to others and the problems that would arise if everyone plugged in, or technological problems, would you plug into the machine for life? Okay? So you're going to have more pleasure. Okay? The technology is possible. The only thing is the relationships with people in there aren't with real people. They're with computer programs and so on. Okay, that you think are real people. Now, again, you'll be happier and you'll have more pleasure in the virtual world created by the machine than you would in this world. Okay. Now, would you enter the machine? Okay, and remember, when you enter, it's for good. It's permanent. If you refuse to enter the machine, you're in the majority. The vast majority of people reject the choice to live a much more pleasurable life in the machine, mostly because they agree with Nozick that living in reality seems to be important, more important than having more pleasure. Opinions differ on what exactly about living in reality is so much better for us than the additional pleasure of living in the experience machine, but the most common response is that a life that is not lived in reality is pointless or meaningless. So, the point is that you want real friends and relationships, not simulated ones. You want maybe meaning, not simply pleasure. You think a life is better if you have real friendships that lead to pleasure than if you have simulated friendships that lead to more pleasure. Now, you might argue that people only value friends because it brings them pleasure or happiness, but the experience machine supposedly disproves that. If one is only seeking pleasure or happiness, they would enter the machine and think that people who enter the machine are most well off because they're experiencing the most pleasure or the most happiness. But this is not the case, right? They're not well off, even though they have more pleasure and more happiness. So the conclusion is that pleasure or happiness is not the only intrinsic good. Sometimes people intrinsically value reality, not simply for the pleasure or happiness it may bring, but they intrinsically value reality, not for some other good that it might bring. Perhaps, too, some of you value beauty, goodness, relationships, finding meaning in life in intrinsically valuable ways, even if it costs you some pleasure or happiness, whatever you mean by happiness. So pleasure and happiness are not all that matters. To quote the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, that actions have real consequences, that our friends are real, and that our experiences are genuine, seem to matter for most of us, regardless of considerations of pleasure or happiness. Now, again, philosophers have been discussing and debating Nozick's thought experiment for decades, but in the end, most recognize that it's a strong objection to a certain form of hedonism, where people claim pleasure is all that matters. So would you enter the machine? Again, imagine the technology is possible. You will think the other people and other minds in this simulation are real, and you won't know the difference between the simulated world, the machine, and the world we live in, which, by the way, may or may not be simulated. You'll experience pain and sadness in the virtual world. Don't forget that. But you'll experience far less of that than you would in this reality. And you will also experience more happiness in the machine than you would in this reality of real people and real relationships, we believe. Now, let's consider some common misconceptions that arise here. Okay. Number one, somebody might say the technology may fail, so I am not going to enter. Here's the reply. It's a thought experiment, not an actual machine. You must imagine it won't fail. And when you do that, it helps you explore your deepest values and whether you value something other than pleasure intrinsically. Okay. Objection 2. But how do we know we aren't in an experience machine right now? Okay. Well, actually, there are some people who believe we are. There's some brilliant arguments for that. It's very interesting. But By the way, you can see my video, Is the World Real, for more on that. But here's the reply. I don't believe we do, that we can prove it. But the point is not to prove we're in a virtual reality or not. The point is to explore your intrinsic values and whether pleasure or happiness are all that you value intrinsically. That's the point, right? Okay, objection 3. The experience machine does not tell me why I should value reality intrinsically, or why I should value reality over the illusion, the simulation, which will bring me great pleasure. What's so special about reality? Okay, here's the reply. The experience machine thought experiment does not claim to explain why you should intrinsically value reality any more than it explains why you should intrinsically value happiness. The experience machine is simply helping you think about whether you do in fact intrinsically value reality and goods other than happiness or pleasure, especially pleasure here. That is, it helps some people see their other intrinsic values like reality. So, in other words, if you ask, why does one prefer reality? And if reality really is an intrinsic value, then that's analogous to asking, why do you value happiness? So it's not surprising that neither question has a more profound answer. Why do I value happiness? Why do I value reality? If they're both intrinsic values, as the experience machine suggests, then there's not going to be an answer for either one, a deeper answer than I just do. So, in other words, to ask, why do I value reality, is to miss the point of the experiment, since the point is that reality is an intrinsic value. All right. Now, another thing that comes up in discussions on this is that, some of you, the experience machine was initially about pleasure, but sometimes we can use it for happiness too, right? And when we're discussing. And sometimes we want a more precise definition of happiness or even pleasure. And I'm not going to give you one at this point, but I am going to explore this problem a little bit later. But it's actually a problem for those who say that happiness is the only intrinsic value. Because if happiness means nearly everything, then they're not saying anything very profound, are they? So, in short, this thought experiment, the first one, the longest one, leads to excellent introspection, discussion, and insights. And each person must introspect for themselves and think about it to better understand what they personally, intrinsically, right, and instrumentally value. In the end, I think it gives you strong reasons for believing that at least pleasure is not all that ultimately matters. Pleasure is not my only intrinsic value. Okay, the next objection, the second objection, is that some people argue that autonomy is valued for its own right and not simply for the happiness it might bring. Now, this argument is developed in many books and literature. It's one of the themes of Brave New World and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Brave New World is a great book and has a lot of arguments in it against the idea of centering your life on pleasure and happiness alone. If you do that, you're going to miss out on some other intrinsic goods like autonomy and truth and beauty and things that we can't quite express here. Okay, so one question that arises in both of these books is, do I want my happiness if I lose my autonomy in the process? If we're correct when we say that happiness and autonomy sometimes conflict, then will happiness always win out over autonomy? Well, perhaps not. So in short, some people believe that autonomy is an intrinsic value, and the evidence for that is that we do not think of ourselves as well off if we become happy and full of pleasure at the price of losing our autonomy. Now, some of you might be thinking, oh, I want autonomy because it makes me happy. But is that really the only reason you want it? That's what these great books want. That's one of the questions they help us explore on a more intuitive and emotional level. But very interesting argument. And again, autonomy is an intrinsic value, is the idea, not just happiness and pleasure. Okay, the third objection is very similar to the first. It's called the two worlds objection. So let me give you my version of this. Let's say two men were equally happy in their lives because they had loving wives, and they believed that the wives were faithful. Okay, Now, both men were equally happy for the same reasons, but the second man's happiness was based on a false belief. His wife didn't really love him, and she wasn't faithful, and so on. Now, wasn't the first man's life better, even though the two men were equally happy? Assume that the two men both lived to the ripe old age of 80, okay, and they both died, both happy, both believed their wives were faithful, and so on. Now, wasn't the first man's life better, though? His wife really was happy and faithful and loved him. If you answer yes, then how can happiness be all that matters? After all, both men were equally happy, and they died happy. Is happiness really valuable when it's based on false beliefs? And it seems like maybe not. Maybe you intrinsically value true beliefs, and not just happiness. Otherwise, you would think both men are equally well off. But no, being well off is not just about being happy. It's also about having happiness based on true beliefs. Otherwise, you would think both men are equally well off. Okay. Now, what I just gave you is a version of Kagan's businessman thought experiment. And it challenges the idea that pleasure is all that matters, but we could substitute happiness as well. And in Kagan's businessman thought experiment, it's the same form, but you can read about it in a little more detail in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Again, which life do you think is better, assuming the amounts of happiness and misery are equal? Now, there's a very advanced analysis from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I'll just read it for about 40 seconds here. Nearly everyone thinks that the deceived businessman has a worse life. This is a problem for hedonists because the pleasure is quantitatively equal in each life, so they should be equally good for the one living it. Qualitative hedonism does not seem to be able to avoid this criticism either, because the falsity of the pleasures experienced by the deceived businessman is a dimension of the pleasure that he never becomes aware of. Theoretically, an externalist and qualitative version of hedonism could include the falsity dimension of an instance of pleasure, even if the falsity dimension never impacts the consciousness of the businessman. However, the resulting definition of pleasure bears little resemblance to what we commonly understand pleasure to be, and also seems to be an ad hoc in its inclusion of the truth dimension, but not others. A dedicated hedonist of any variety can always stubbornly stick to the claim that the lives of the two businessmen are of equal value. But they will do little to convince the vast majority to take hedonism, prudential hedonism, more seriously. So you can read more in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, but the bottom line is this. Such examples suggest that there are other intrinsic goods. Pleasure and happiness are not all that ultimately matters. In the minds of most people, pleasure and happiness are not the sole measure of well-being. One man in this scenario is living a better life than the other, even though the amounts of pleasure and happiness are identical. Okay, objection number 4 was originally from Phillipa Foot. You might be able to counter this one. Let's say lobotomizing one of your children will guarantee their happiness. Okay, would you do it if such an operation would guarantee the most happiness for the child? Well, maybe some parents are kind of already doing that metaphorically, but I won't go there. If not, if you wouldn't do the operation, which would guarantee happiness, if not, are you intrinsically valuing something other than happiness? Perhaps you might argue that nobody is really happy with a lobotomy. Okay, that's good. That's an interesting discussion to explore, and you may be correct, but the challenge is then to more precisely explain what you mean by happiness, and we'll explore that criticism in a moment. Okay, let's go to the 5th criticism. This is from Russ Schaefer Landau in his book, The Fundamentals of Ethics. Let's say there were 2 people who lived lives with the same amount of happiness and suffering. They both died and had the same amount. If hedonism is true, then both lives were equally good because the same amount of happiness and suffering was present in the 2 lives. However, imagine that the first person experienced great happiness at the beginning of his life, and then it went all downhill from there. So this first person, let's say it's a she suffered more and more as each decade passed. The second person is the opposite. She experienced more misery in her first couple of decades, but then her happiness increased and her suffering decreased with each passing decade. Now, isn't the second person's life better? We're playing with your intuitions here, right? If so, then the overall quality of life is not simply based on net happiness minus suffering. It's also based on whether one's life has an upward or downward trajectory. So ask yourself this: is the life of a progressively more happiness, more and more happiness, better than the life with progressively less and less happiness with each decade, even though the total net happiness of the two lives is identical? And if one is better than the other, and most say that the progressively happier life is better, if one is better than the other, then why? They both had the same net happiness and minus suffering, happiness minus suffering. So now some of you might object and say, well, one feels the progressively better life is better because one keeps projecting the trend beyond death, and they think it'll eventually result in more happiness. But there are some problems with this reply, and can you identify them? So again, maybe happiness and pleasure are not all that matters. Maybe it's what also matters is whether there's an upward or a downward trajectory. Objection 6 is Objection 6 to hedonism is the paradox of hedonism. Now, consider this poem excerpt. I sought the bird of bliss, and she flew away. I sought my neighbor's good, and bliss came my way. Consider, too, this Hawthorne excerpt. Happiness is like a butterfly, which when pursued is always beyond our grasp, but if you sit down quietly, it may alight upon you. Now, if happiness is the only thing that makes us better off, then shouldn't we pursue it all the time? Well, yeah, we should pursue happiness all the time, shouldn't we, if it's what makes us better off? The only thing that makes us better off. But the paradox of hedonism explains why it's not rational to do that. So happiness isn't the only thing that makes us better off. When you think about this, it does not mean that happiness isn't all that matters, but it does mean that to get happiness, we should not aim at happiness. So the paradox is that if happiness is all that matters, then you should not aim at it. If pleasure is all that matters, then you should not aim at it, because the best forms of happiness and pleasure come not when you're seeking them, but when you're seeking excellence or being good at something or towards someone or caring for others and not only oneself. So here's the question. Does it make sense to argue that we shouldn't aim for the only thing that matters? Now, there might be a profound answer here, but make sure you are not using a strategy that your opponents could use against you here. Okay, the 7th objection is the definition game I mentioned earlier. So how shall we define pleasure? Is the pleasure in reading a book comparable to the pleasure of smoking a cigar? Is the pleasure of jumping on a grenade to save people? Is that like the pleasure of shooting a duck? Is the happiness of a highly moral life comparable to the happiness of a highly immoral life? Would you rather be good or happy, assuming that they do conflict sometimes? Is the happiness of watching a sunset comparable to the happiness of winning a contest? These sorts of questions challenge you to precisely define pleasure or happiness, to unify the many ways in which these words are used. The criticism that arises is, hedonism seems too simplistic because it puts so much under the word happiness, or maybe pleasure, right? But let's use happiness. So happiness is inflated, it's vague, it's almost meaningless because it includes so much. So it's easy to argue that everyone ultimately seeks happiness if you define happiness so broadly as to include everything. And maybe that's part of our language, a language problem, but can't we separate happiness from joy, separate happiness from contentment, pleasure, separate happiness and maybe even pleasure from dopamine releases in the brain, separate happiness from peace or accomplishment of one's goals, and so on? Perhaps hedonism seems persuasive to people because the words happiness and even pleasure are so vague and so inflated. And so this criticism would say, well, everybody's seeking happiness, but boy, that includes a lot. So we're not all seeking the same thing intrinsically, right? Okay, let's do the evolution digression for a moment. So I'd like to briefly discuss how people often misunderstand and misapply evolution on this topic, and in other ethical topics as well. So some people seem to think that evolution implies that people are somehow always seeking survival. But evolution does not imply that. Such people are confusing the nature of the desire or the nature of the value with the mechanism that selects the desire or value. And evolution by natural selection is one of those mechanisms. So to think that I'm always seeking survival or pleasure simply because evolution weeds out traits that don't support survival or pleasure is like thinking a Jewish prisoner is a Nazi because the Nazi is determining whether or not the Jew lives. There's nothing in evolution that says I'm always seeking survival. Rather, it merely states that whatever genetically based desires I have are more likely to be passed on to my children and so on if they help me or my species survive. There's nothing in evolution that implies everyone is selfish deep down or that happiness and pleasure are the only intrinsic values. Rather, evolution by natural selection merely states that whatever desires one has, whether altruistic, selfish, a combination of both, whatever values and desires and so on, if they're genetically based, they're selected based on whether they're adapted to the environment. That's all it says. Maybe a really clear example we can use will involve sex. So let's say the primary evolutionary explanation for why people feel sexual desire is reproduction. Does it follow that everyone wants to reproduce when they engage in sex? Well, of course not, right? Most people want to have sex for pleasure, not reproduction. Some people have sex out of obligation as well as pleasure. Right? Now, prostitutes, they're not even motivated by, well, probably not motivated much by pleasure, but by money, right? So even if sexual desire is naturally selected for survival reasons, it does not follow that human sexual motives are ultimately about reproduction, right? So let's take it back to the topic. There may be many people who intrinsically value truth and real relationships, just as others value intrinsically happiness and pleasure. And some of you may be highly altruistic, which means you sometimes act for the interests of others without expecting something in return. These types of desires and values are not impossible under evolution. Right? Indeed, when you look at the actual research out there, there's a lot of support for them. You can see some of my other videos. So we don't want to go down that route. It's actually just the opposite. So in short, intrinsically valuing truth, reality, goodness, as well as happiness and pleasure is possible under an evolutionary framework. Also, valuing something intrinsically other than my survival or the survival of my family is possible under an evolutionary framework. So let's go to criticism 9. Okay, objection 8. So in another video, I outlined the major themes of Frankl's book, The Man's Search for Meaning. Now, in that book, he argued that the ultimate human motivation is to find meaning, not pleasure or happiness. That is, when pleasure or happiness conflict with our search for meaning, people will sometimes choose meaning because it's an intrinsic value that sometimes trumps the intrinsic value of happiness or pleasure. So these sorts of arguments, these books, based on historical accounts, they suggest that pleasure and happiness are not the only intrinsic goods. Meaning is also an intrinsic good. So if this is correct, then happiness and pleasure is not all that matters. At least some people will choose meaning, right, when it conflicts with pleasure and happiness, though according to Frankl, only about 10 to 20% of the population may do that. So do you agree? Now, you might get caught up on defining good or meaning, but don't do that. We don't have to agree that there's an objective meaning to life for this criticism to work. As you discussed, notice I might give up short-term pleasure for meaning, but notice too that I might give up long-term pleasure for meaning. But would I give up happiness for meaning? If you say no, how exactly are you defining happiness? Is it an inflated definition? So someone might argue that finding or creating meaning makes me happy and that's why I do it. But that seems like it might confuse motive with consequence, where the motive is meaning and the consequence is happiness. It's also, again, arguably using a vague or inflated meaning of happiness. Now, also, maybe I sometimes choose pleasure and happiness because it brings me meaning, in which case pleasure and happiness in that context become instrumental goods and meaning becomes an intrinsic good. So when you read books like Frankl's Search for Meaning and you're thinking deeply, you're questioning whether pleasure and happiness are your only intrinsic values. Maybe you can choose to have another intrinsic value, or you already do, and maybe one of those is how you make meaning in life. Okay, criticism 9. So I wanted to have an even 10, so I looked up a couple more arguments here. These are from Don Burkich. The first one is the honor argument. So suppose the wild cards, an elite squadron of Marines, is caught in a bombing raid. Everyone in the squad except West is knocked unconscious. West is seriously injured, but manages to drag each person to safety. Upon rescuing the last squad member, West collapses and dies. Now Vanson is the first to wake up, and she takes credit for the rescue, is promptly promoted, and becomes one of the best generals the Marines ever had. No one ever discovers that Vanson told a lie. Right? Now, if happiness is all that matters, then there's nothing wrong here. So the argument is like this. Premise 1. If happiness is all that matters, then Vanson's lying is morally right, because net happiness was achieved. She was promoted, greatest general, and so on. Okay, so premise 1 is if happiness is all that matters ultimately, then lying is morally right. Premise 2, Vanson's lying is not morally right. Now for premise 2, you have to answer that for yourself. It's a subjective thing. Do you think it's morally right or not? Okay. If you think it's morally wrong, then it seems like you're not just valuing happiness here. Okay. Because happiness was maximized by the lie. So it should remind you a little bit of these utilitarian counter-arguments, right? Okay, and then the conclusion is simply happiness is not all that matters. So if the honor argument is sound, honor is also intrinsic good. It sometimes trumps happiness. Okay, let's look at his other argument, friendship. Suppose Brian pretends to be his wealthy roommate Jay's best friend. Now Jay is extremely generous with his money, and he's particularly generous with Brian since he firmly believes that Brian is his best friend. Behind Jay's back, however, Brian laughs and complains about Jay. So if happiness is all that matters, if that's true, or pleasure, or something like happiness, then Brian's deception is morally right. Now you have to ask yourself, subjectively, according to your own moral opinion, whether or not you think it's morally right, that deception, that it's nevertheless maximizing happiness. Okay, so premise 2 assumes that you say his deception is not morally right. And if that's correct, then happiness is not all that matters. So perhaps then true friendship is also something that's good in itself. It's an intrinsic good. We don't seek true friends simply and solely because they make us happy. True friendship is something we seek also for itself, not simply because it makes us happy. Now, you may seek true friends because it makes you happy, but you also seek them because friendship is good in itself. And by the way, this is how Aristotle argued about friendship long ago. He argued just that. So this, again, would mean that something other than happiness is good in itself according to your own subjective thinking and your own moral values and so on. Okay? It appears to follow that happiness isn't all that matters to you, subjectively. It's not the sole intrinsic good in your psyche. Okay? Contrary to what a certain type of hedonism implies or says, right? So those are the 10 arguments. Let's consider the conclusion now. Okay, we've gone through 10 arguments, and I believe some of these can be answered by the hedonist, but some are serious challenges. These sorts of questions and thought experiments should give you a sense for why many philosophers reject this form of hedonism. Pleasure is not all that ultimately matters. Happiness is not all that ultimately matters, at least not to everyone, and not to me. Most humans have other intrinsic goods, whether they realize it or not. So what else intrinsically matters? In the previous arguments, if you were persuaded by any of these arguments and intuition games, it seems that reality, real relationships, not just simulated ones, moral goodness, meaning, truth, nature, honor, friendship, the trajectory of life, all of those may be among your own intrinsic values, right? They may be among the intrinsic values that sometimes override the intrinsic values of happiness and pleasure, right? So you may protest and say, but why should I value reality? Now remember, if you ask that question, you just miss the point of these arguments. If they show that these goods are intrinsically valued, then there's no further reason why we, at a subjective and motivational level, should value them. You should value reality because it's reality. That's the nature of intrinsic valuing. And you value happiness because it's happiness. That's the nature of intrinsic valuing. Okay, now evolution may then weed out people who intrinsically value A, B, and C, but not those who intrinsically value X, Y, and Z, but that's irrelevant to what you currently intrinsically value, right? And evolution is a different topic. You can see the evolution and ethics video for more on that. Now, one counter argument that's very interesting is that happiness is so deeply intertwined with other concepts like reality, truth, and authentic relationships that it's artificial to separate them. Like these thought experiments do, separate them, right? But how can you prove that without begging the question or using a definition of happiness that's so vague or so inflated so as to include almost anything that's valued? In short, these questions and thought experiments certainly do seem to work against most definitions of happiness and pleasure. So if this is right, how will you live your life? Will you do the right thing even if it doesn't maximize your happiness? Will you seek happiness while also recognizing that it's not the only element of good life? Though arguably a very important element, but also you intrinsically value truth and reality and friendship or whatever, right? So I personally believe there are other intrinsic values in most humans and in myself. Sometimes happiness wins out. That's an intrinsic value in me. But sometimes the other intrinsic values like reality or authenticity win out. So I, disagree with one type of hedonism. Also, I don't think that consciously aiming towards happiness is the best way to achieve happiness or the best way to live. I want to be happy, but I believe it's usually better to aim for excellence or goodness or, enjoying the time with your friend, focusing on your friend or whatever, for themselves and not simply because they might make me happy. Right? Or maybe there's something to simply being aware of everything now, whether happy or unhappy, so that a form of peace arises that is deeper than any pleasure or definition of happiness out there. And I don't want, I don't simply want my children to be happy, though that's really important. I also want them to be good and authentic and honorable and at peace and virtuous and so on and thoughtful and, so much more. Yeah, there's a deeper reason for why I want these things for them. It's not simply because having good children makes me happy, unless, of course, you inflate the meaning of happiness. So, in the end, yes, I think there are other intrinsic goods that I value. What do you think? Thanks.